Leaving my 66-year-old sick wife at home, I never thought she would be treated so cruelly. Our daughter-in-law snapped at her. "Get up and clean the kitchen. This house doesn't run itself." When my wife faltered, the woman yanked her hair, throwing her to the floor. My own son just sat there, turning up the TV to drown out his mother's groans. They thought an old, retired auditor was helpless. 24 hours later, they were left with nothing, begging for mercy. Thank you for being here on Wise Revenge. It means everything. Drop a comment and let me know what city or country are you joining from today. You'd be surprised how far this community reaches. Some elements of this story are fictional, shaped for entertainment and deeper understanding. Names and settings are coincidental. The lessons, however, are entirely yours to keep. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over the Willamette Valley in the early morning before the mist burns off the hillside, and the first light touches the rows of dormant grapevines stretching down toward the road. I have sat on this back porch with a cup of Earl Grey for going on 4 decades, watching that light move across the land, the way a man watches something he knows belongs to him, not out of arrogance but out of deep, earned familiarity. My name is Clayton Hawthorne. I am 68 years old. I spent 31 years as a federal auditor for the United States Department of the Treasury, reviewing financial disclosures, tracing asset movements, identifying the precise moment when a person's choices crossed the line from ambition into fraud. I have sat across from corporate executives, elected officials, and self-made millionaires who believed their paperwork was airtight. It never was. Not once in 31 years did I walk away without finding the thread that unraveled everything. You just had to know where to look, and you had to be willing to wait. I retired 12 years ago. Rosamond and I settled into the life we had been building in pieces since the day we were married. This property, 14 acres of hillside land outside Portland, Oregon, was not inherited, not gifted. Every acre was purchased with money we earned and saved across 4 decades of careful, deliberate work. We broke ground on the main house in 1986. We planted the back garden the following spring. We raised our son Preston in the East Wing bedroom with the window that looks out over the valley. Rosamond. I want to be precise about her, because she is the reason this story exists at all. She is 66 years old. She taught 3rd grade for 22 years. She leaves her tea to go cold every time she sits down to read, because she forgets it is there the moment a book opens. She laughs at Beckett's jokes, even when they make no sense, which is most of the time, and her laugh when she does that is the best sound I have heard in 43 years of being her husband. She is also the most patient person I have ever known. More patient than she should have been. More patient than I understood until it was almost too late. Our son Preston grew up well-loved, and I will say this plainly, too comfortable. He learned early that effort was optional when charm was available. I believed that a man who never has to fight for anything will eventually be unable to fight for anything. I was right in ways I would have preferred to be wrong about. Preston was 31 when he brought Delancey Breckenridge home for the first time. It was a Sunday in April. Rosamond had made pot roast. The valley was green in the particular way it gets in Oregon spring, almost aggressively alive. Preston came through the front door 20 minutes late, which was standard, with Delancey at his shoulder and the look on his face of a man who wants you to be impressed before he asks you for something. Delancey Breckenridge was 30 years old, and striking in the way certain people are striking, deliberately, carefully, with significant effort made to appear effortless. She wore a cream blouse and pressed trousers and a smile that arrived on her face a full second after her eyes did. I noticed that. In 31 years of federal audit work, I had learned that the gap between what a person's eyes do and what their mouth does is where the truth lives. She shook my hand. Firm grip, cold fingers. And while she said, Mr. Hawthorne, what a beautiful home. Her eyes did something that had nothing to do with the words coming out of her mouth. They moved quickly, but not quickly enough. Across the entryway ceiling, down to the original hardwood floors, to the oil painting above the fireplace that Rosamond's father had left us, to the double doors that opened onto the back terrace and the 14 acres beyond. She was not admiring our home. She was appraising it. I shook her hand. I told her it was a pleasure. I poured her a glass of Pinot Gris from the vineyard 3 miles down the road and watched her relax into the evening with the ease of someone who has decided a situation is manageable. Rosamond made her feel welcome the way Rosamond made everyone feel welcome, completely, generously, without condition. When dinner was finished and Preston walked Delancey to the car, I excused myself, walked to my seat, sat down at my desk, opened a new file on my computer, and typed her full name at the top of the page. Delancey Marie Breckenridge. Beckett was 3 years old then, just beginning to string full sentences together in the wonderfully uncertain way of toddlers. I had already started teaching him small things. How to identify birds at the backfeeder. How to tell which clouds meant rain. And I had shown him how the little smart watch I had gotten him worked the red button on the side, the emergency recording function. How if he ever saw something that frightened him and could not call for help, he could press that button and it would record everything and keep it safe. I told him, kneeling to his level the way you do when you want a child to remember something. If you ever see something wrong and you cannot stop it, Beckett, record it. The truth always needs a witness. He nodded the way small children nod when they are not entirely sure what you mean, but understand that it matters. I did not know on that April Sunday that I was planting a seed that would one day save everything. In 31 years of federal audit work, I learned that the most dangerous people are not the ones who come in shouting. They are the ones who come in smiling, looking at your walls and your ceilings, quietly calculating what belongs to them. Delancey Breckenridge did not come to join our family. She came to own it. And for 3 years, I let her believe she was succeeding. The thing about a slow erosion is that it does not announce itself. It happens the way water works on limestone, patiently, invisibly, one small dissolution at a time, until the day you look down and realize the ground beneath you is no longer what it was. That is how Delancey Breckenridge moved through our home. She and Preston married 8 months after that first Sunday dinner. I paid for none of it. Preston's savings covered perhaps a third. The remainder went on to a credit card in his name that I did not learn about until much later. They moved into the East Wing 6 weeks after the wedding. Temporary, Preston said. Just until they found the right place in Portland. Rosamond set up the guest rooms herself, put fresh flowers on the dresser, made sure the bathroom had good towels. By the end of the first month, the flowers were gone, and the guest rooms had become Delancey's rooms. The changes came in a sequence I documented carefully, because documentation is what I know how to do. First, the kitchen schedule. Delancey informed Rosamond pleasantly enough on the surface that she preferred the kitchen clear after 9 in the evening, because the sounds disturbed her sleep. Rosamond, who had baked bread in that kitchen at 10 o'clock on Sunday nights for 30 years, simply nodded and adjusted her schedule. "It's fine, Clay," she told me that night when I pressed her. "She's young, she has her routines. We can work around it." I wrote it down. Date, time, exact, wording the way I had written down 10,000 anomalies over 31 years. Facts have a way of becoming useful when you least expect it. 3 months after the wedding, Lavinia Breckenridge arrived. Delancey's mother was 56, operated with the supreme self-assurance of a woman who had spent decades confusing confidence with competence. She told us she was visiting for a few weeks, while her Pearl District apartment was being renovated. The renovation, as it turned out, did not exist. Within 10 days of her arrival, She had rearranged the furniture, requested Rosamond keep the hallway light off after 8, and begun referring to the dining room as her sitting room in the mornings. Rosamond started eating breakfast in the garden. She had eaten at that dining room table for 38 years, watched the east light come through those windows every morning of our marriage. She moved to the garden without complaint, without confrontation, without a single word to me about it, because that is who she is. She absorbs. She accommodates. She gives ground the way people give ground when they have been taught over a lifetime that their own discomfort matters less than other people's peace. It took me 3 weeks to notice. When I did something tightened in my chest, I did not have a clean name for. I called Alden Montgomery that same evening. 19 years as my personal attorney, sharp as a freshly filed tax return, constitutionally incapable of telling a client what they wanted to hear instead of what they needed to know. Pull all of the trust documents, I said. Everything we structured 5 years ago. The occupancy agreement, the beneficiary designations, the asset transfer records. All of it. Is something happening, Clayton? Not yet, I said. I want everything exactly where it needs to be before something does. How long do you want to wait? Until they give us something we cannot lose with. Something that cannot be explained away in front of a judge. I'll know it when I see it. That was year 1. In year 2, Delancey informed Rosamond that the home health aide who came Tuesday and Thursday mornings. Donna, 4 years with us, was an unnecessary expense and had been let go. She had handled the termination herself, she said, as a favor. Rosamond's face did not change when she heard this, but her hands they pressed flat against the kitchen counter, the way they do when she is working very hard to keep something inside. I called Donna that afternoon, apologized, and quietly arranged 3 months of severance from a personal account Delancey did not know existed. Then I noted in my file, Delancey had made a personnel decision about a household employee without consulting either of the household's actual owners. I noted Preston standing in the doorway, nodding slowly, like a man who has long since stopped having opinions of his own. I could have reversed it that afternoon with a single phone call. What stopped me was the same calculation I had been running for months. A confrontation without complete evidence would give them time to regroup, reframe the situation as a family misunderstanding, and claim the moral high ground. I needed the full picture before I moved. I chose to wait. I have not decided, looking back, whether that was wisdom or its own kind of failure. Now the camera, along the northern edge of the back garden, mounted beneath the equipment shed. Even there was a security camera I had installed 11 years earlier. About 2 years after Preston and Delancey moved in, Delancey noticed the indicator light and asked about it. I told her it had been malfunctioning for months. The light flickered, but the unit had stopped recording. I hadn't gotten around to replacing it. She accepted this. I had anticipated she would. Delancey held a particular assumption about older men, that they were slow to address practical matters, indifferent to technology, easily taken at their word on mechanical subjects. It was an assumption I had cultivated carefully. What I had actually done was disconnect the indicator light from the power supply, while leaving the camera fully operational, syncing automatically to a private cloud server every 4 hours. Delancey believed the camera was dead. It was in fact the most attentive witness on the property. By the end of year 3, Rosamond had been displaced from her kitchen, her dining room, her morning routine, and her Thursday help. The woman who had built this home from bare ground was navigating around the schedules of people who had contributed nothing to its existence. I watched it happen. I documented it. I reminded myself of what I had told Alden: wait for the thing that cannot be explained away. The morning I found Rosamond sitting alone in the garden with a cold cup of coffee and a look I had never seen in 43 years. Not sadness exactly, but something closer to the expression of a person who has forgotten they have the right to object. I called Alden again. "How close are we?" "Everything is in place," he said. "The trust is airtight. We are ready whenever you are." Good. I looked at Rosamond through the window, both palms flat on the garden table, staring at something I could not see. "It won't be long. They are not as careful as they think they are." I was right. 6 months later, on a cold and rainy Friday afternoon in November, they stopped being careful altogether. I want to take you back 6 months before that Friday in November. Back to a Tuesday morning in May, when the valley was warm and the roses along the back fence were in full bloom, and I was sitting at my desk with a second cup of coffee and the kind of ordinary quiet that makes a man believe briefly that the world is operating as it should. My phone rang at 8:43. The screen read Marcus Webb. Marcus was the regional director of Pacific Northwest Banking, 15 years of knowing each other long enough that he called me Clayton instead of Mr. Hawthorne, and long enough that when he called on a Tuesday morning without a scheduled reason, I set my coffee cup down before I answered. "Clayton." His voice had the particular flatness of a man delivering information he would rather not deliver. "I need to flag something on the Hawthorne Consulting account, a transaction pattern you should look at directly." Outside my window, a pair of barn swallows were working on a nest under the south eave. I watched them. "Pull the complete transaction history for the past 24 months, I said. "Every outgoing transfer, every supplemental card charge above $500. Send it to my secure email, not the shared account." "Within the hour," Marcus said. "Clayton, is everything all right?" "It will be," I said. "Thank you for calling me directly." The file arrived at 9:17. I opened it and began at the top, methodical, linear, no skipping ahead, no forming conclusions before the data is complete. The same system I had used for 31 years. What I found took 40 minutes to fully document. The first transfer, March of the previous year. $60,000 from the Hawthorne Consulting LLC operating account to a personal savings account registered to Lavinia Ann Breckenridge, authorized via the supplemental card issued to Preston Hawthorne. The second transfer, October, 7 months later. $70,000. Same destination, same authorization. The third, the one Marcus had flagged, $50,000 2 weeks ago. $180,000. 14 months. 3 transactions, each spaced far enough apart to avoid automatic fraud flagging thresholds. I want to be precise about the Hawthorne Consulting LLC account, because it matters to everything that follows. This was not a joint account or a family account. It was a business operating account established in my name alone 11 years ago. Preston had been issued a supplemental authorization card for specific legitimate purposes, vendor payments, occasional travel expenses. The card carried a $10,000 monthly limit and was subject to my oversight as the sole account holder. Delancey had used that card through Preston's credential to move $180,000 into her mother's personal savings account. 3 times. Moving funds from a business account through fraudulent authorization to a third-party personal account is not a civil dispute. Under 18 United States Code Section 1343, the federal wire fraud statute, it is a federal crime carrying penalties of up to 20 years in prison per count. 3 counts. I closed the laptop. I walked to the kitchen and poured the rest of my coffee down the sink because my hands needed something to do that wasn't breaking something. Then I stood at the window and looked at the rose bushes for a long time. Here is what I did not do. I did not walk into the main house and confront Delancey. I did not call Preston. I did not raise my voice or slam a door. I am not a man who acts on the first wave of feeling. I am a man who waits for the data to be complete. I went back to my desk and called Alden. I need you to listen carefully, I said when he answered. Do not react. Just listen. I told him about the 3 transfers, the total, the authorization method, the destination account. I heard him draw a slow breath. Wire fraud, he said quietly. Federal. 3 counts, I said. But I don't want to move on this yet. Clayton. Not yet. This is strong, but it is financial. A skilled defense attorney will argue implied authorization, family loan, private arrangement. It will get complicated. I paused. I want something cleaner, something physical, something that cannot be framed as a misunderstanding by anyone in any courtroom. Alden was quiet for a moment. Then, you're going to wait for them to do something worse. I'm going to wait for them to do something they cannot explain, I said. There is a difference. In 31 years of audit work, I have never once met people capable of what these 2 are capable of who managed to stop on their own. They will give us what we need. People like this always do. I filed the transaction records in my secure archive alongside 3 years of behavioral documentation. I noted the date, the amounts, the authorization trail. I noted that I had chosen to wait. Then I went out to the garden. Rosamond was deadheading the roses in the afternoon sun, her hands moving through the stems, with the easy familiarity of someone who has tended the same plants for decades. She looked up when she heard the back door and smiled at me, the real one with the small crease at the corner of her left eye that only appears when it is genuine. You look like you've been thinking very hard about something, she said. Nothing that won't keep, I told her. She tilted her head the way she does when she doesn't entirely believe me but has decided not to press. Then she held out a pair of clippers. Come help me with the back row. You think better when your hands are busy. She was right. She has always been right about that. I took the clippers. We worked through the back row together in the warm May afternoon, and I did not tell her what I had found, because there was nothing she could do about it yet, and everything I could do about it in time. I filed it away in the part of my mind where I keep things that are not finished yet. 6 months later, on a Friday afternoon in November, they finished it for me. I was not home that Friday afternoon. Everything I am about to tell you was reconstructed afterward from what Beckett told me that night, from what Helen Ashford told me the following morning, and from what 2 cameras recorded with the indifferent precision of machines that do not flinch and do not forget. I was in Portland. Rosamond had insisted I go. She had said that morning plainly and without room for argument that she was resting comfortably, that Dr. Cole's instructions were clear, and that I should not cancel a meeting 5 years in the making over a fever she could manage on her own. I had believed her because she had never once given me a reason not to. Alden and I had been in his conference room since 10 that morning, working through the final review of the trust documentation, the occupancy agreement, the beneficiary structure, the asset transfer records that had been sitting in place for 5 years, waiting for exactly the kind of moment I had told him would come. I had my phone face up on the table the way I always do when Rosamond is home without me. She had not called. I told myself that was fine. Rosamond did not call unless she needed something, and she rarely allowed herself to need anything. At 2 o'clock, while Alden was walking me through the revised clause language on the conditional occupancy termination provisions, Rosamond was lying in the garden cottage bedroom with a fever of 39.4 degrees. Her 3rd day of it, chest-tight breathing, shallow, from the viral pneumonia Dr. Cole had diagnosed the previous Tuesday and told her required complete rest for at least another week. She had downplayed it on the phone the night before, told me she was feeling better, told me not to rush back. That was Rosamond. She had been managing her own discomfort quietly for so long, she had lost the habit of reporting it. At 2:15, Helen Ashford came to the front gate. Helen had lived next door for 16 years. She was 64, recently retired from 30 years as a high school librarian, and possessed the particular combination of warmth and stubbornness that makes certain women genuinely impossible to dismiss. She had made chicken soup that morning, the real kind whole bird celery root fresh thyme from her garden, because Rosamond had mentioned the fever in passing 3 days ago, and Helen had been thinking about it ever since. Delancey answered the door. "Rosamond's resting. She's not up for visitors today." "I know she's under the weather," Helen said. "I just want to drop this off. She really needs her rest. I'll let her know you stopped by." Delancey began to close the door. Helen put her hand on the doorframe. "Not pushing. Just present. It'll take me 10 seconds to walk it around back. She's sleeping. I'll make sure she gets it." Helen looked past Delancey into the house. What she saw was the light, a faint flickering light from the direction of the garden cottage visible through the side hallway window. The cottage light that would only be moving like that if someone inside was trying to get up. She did not push further. She was not the kind of woman who made scenes. But she did not leave. She stepped back from the door, walked to the stone wall along the property line, set the soup pot on top of it, and sat down on the bench beside it. She told me later, "I just had a feeling, Clayton. I couldn't have told you exactly what it was, but I wasn't going to drive away." Inside the main house, Delancey walked down the hall to where Preston was parked in the leather armchair with a college football game on the television, the volume high enough that Helen could hear it faintly from the wall. Delancey said something to him. Preston reached for his coffee mug without taking his eyes off the screen. Then Delancey walked out the back door toward the garden cottage. Beckett had come around the side of the main house looking for his soccer ball, which had rolled into the cottage garden during a game earlier that afternoon. He was wearing his school sweatshirt and mud-stained sneakers, and he came around the corner of the cottage just as Delancey stepped through the door. He stopped. He stayed in the shadow of the cottage eave where he could see through the half-open door without being seen. He told me later he had not planned to stay and watch. But something about the way Delancey's shoulders looked when she walked through that door, tight and pulled back, and purposeful in a way that frightened him, made his feet stop moving. What he heard first was Delancey's voice clipped and carrying. "Rosamond, I need you up. The kitchen and the back sitting room need to be cleared before 4. We had people here last night and the whole place is a disaster." A pause. Then Rosamond's voice, careful and quiet. "Delancey, I'm running a fever. Dr. Cole said I need to rest for..." "I know what Dr. Cole said. Flat and final. I also know that this house doesn't run itself. Donna isn't here anymore. We all have responsibilities." Another pause. The sound of the bed creaking, someone trying to sit up. "All right," Rosamond said. "Give me a few minutes." Delancey knocked once when she arrived at that door. Not gently. The sharp, impatient knock of someone who considers knocking a formality rather than a courtesy. And from inside Rosamond's voice, thin with fever, "Come in." Beckett pressed himself back against the cottage wall. His right hand found the face of the little smart watch on his left wrist, the one with the red button on the side. He remembered what I had told him. He thought about it for 3 full seconds. Then he pressed the button. He adjusted the angle of his wrist so the camera faced the door. And he stayed very still. Because an 8-year-old boy had decided that the truth needed a witness, and somewhere above him in the shadow of the equipment, Shed Eve, a second camera that everyone believed was broken, had already been recording for 11 minutes. What happened next? I know the way a man knows the contents of a wound he did not witness, but must still treat through testimony, through evidence, through the terrible clarity of a child's memory. Beckett told me everything that night. He sat across from me at my desk, with his hands wrapped around a mug of hot chocolate he kept lifting and setting down without drinking, and he told me in the careful, sequential way children tell things when they understand instinctively that the details matter. He had already cried alone, crouched behind the rose bushes in the cottage garden after it was over. By the time he came to find me, he had put the crying away and replaced it with something that looked in an 8-year-old's face uncomfortably like resolve. Inside the cottage, Rosamond had managed to get herself upright, sitting on the edge of the bed in her dark green cardigan, with the wooden buttons, feet in her slippers, hair still loose from lying down. She looked, Beckett told me, like someone working very hard at something that should not require work. Delancey stood in the center of the room with her arms crossed, watching Rosamond try to stand the way you watch a slow process you have no intention of assisting. "I need the kitchen counters cleared and the back sitting room straightened before 4, she said. "The dishes from last night are still in the sink." Rosamond steadied herself against the bedpost. "I'll do what I can. I may need to sit down partway through." "That's fine." Delancey said 2 words with the texture of something that was not fine at all. "Just get it done." She turned and walked out. Rosamond followed slowly, one hand trailing along the cottage wall, her breathing audible from where Beckett stood, pressed against the outer wall in the shadow of the eave. His heart was going fast enough to feel in his throat, he told me. But his wrist stayed level. He had decided the camera was more important than anything else he was feeling. Rosamond made it across the flagstones through the back door into the hallway. Beckett slipped in after them, staying close to the wall. The hallway is perhaps 20 feet from the back door to the kitchen. Rosamond had covered half of it when her left knee buckled. She caught herself against the wall with both palms and stood there, shoulders shaking with the effort of a breath that would not come easily. Preston was 12 feet away in the sitting room, visible through the open doorway. The television was loud, a crowd roaring over a touchdown. He turned his head and looked directly at his mother, struggling against the wall. "Mom, you okay?" "I'm all right," Rosamond said, "just catching my breath." He looked at her for 2 seconds. Then he looked back at the screen. He did not get up. Delancey turned around when she heard Rosamond's palms hit the wall. She walked back. She stopped in front of Rosamond and looked at her the way you look at something not performing to specification. "I don't have time for this. Either you can do this or you cannot. Which is it?" Rosamond lifted her head. She straightened her spine. "I know that motion. I have watched it for 43 years. It is what she does when she is about to do something that costs her." "I can do it," she said. "I just need a moment." "You've had 3 days of moments. I need the kitchen done." She reached out. Beckett said the motion was faster than it should have been for something so deliberate. Delancey's right hand closed around the base of Rosamond's ponytail and pulled. Not a push, not a shove. A pull, sharp, directional, designed to move the person not prepared to be moved. Rosamond made a sound. Small. Surprised more than pained, the sound of someone who genuinely did not believe this was going to happen to them. Her footing went. Her left shoulder struck the doorframe. Her right hip caught the baseboard. She landed on the hallway floor on her hands and one knee and stayed there. From the sitting room, the television roared. The volume went up. Beckett looked through the doorway at his father. Preston had the remote in his right hand, jaw set, eyes forward, turning the volume up with the concentrated deliberateness of a man who has made a decision. Beckett told me, "Dad heard it, grandfather. I know he heard it because I saw his hand move before she even fell. He was 8 years old. He understood exactly what he was seeing." Delancey looked down at Rosamond on the floor. She did not help. She did not speak. She stepped around her, walked into the kitchen, and opened the refrigerator. Rosamond stayed on the floor for a long moment, hands flat on the hardwood, head down. Her lips were moving. Beckett could not hear what she was saying from where he stood. He told me he was almost certain she was saying my name. Clayton. He told me this, and his voice did not waver. But his hands tightened around the hot chocolate mug until his knuckles went pale, and I did not say anything for a moment. Because there are things a grandfather should not have to hear from an 8-year-old, and that was one of them. Rosamond gathered herself, one knee, then the other, one hand on the wall. She stood back up. She straightened her cardigan and walked into the kitchen. Beckett slipped back out the way he had come. He went to the garden, crouched behind the rose bushes where no one could see him, and he cried for exactly as long as he needed to. Then he dried his face on his sweatshirt sleeve, removed the memory card from his watch, the way I had taught him, and held it in his closed fist. He waited for me to come home. By the time I pulled into the driveway at 5 o'clock, 3 things had happened that Delancey Breckenridge did not know about. A camera she believed was broken had recorded everything from above. A watch on an 8-year-old boy's wrist had recorded everything from 4 feet away. And a woman still sitting at the stone wall with a pot of cold soup had heard enough to know that what happened inside that house on a Friday afternoon in November was not an accident, and was not nothing, and was not going to be forgotten. I parked, I got out, and instead of walking to the main house the way I always do, something made me turn left toward the garden cottage. I have never been able to explain that instinct. I just knew. The garden cottage door was unlocked, it always is. Rosamond has never seen the point of locking it when we are home, and somewhere around our 15th anniversary, I stopped arguing with her about it. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The bedside lamp was on. The bed was unmade. Blankets pushed back in the hurried way of someone who left faster than they intended. The dark green cardigan with the wooden buttons was gone. The room smelled of mentholated cough drops and several days of sickness. She was not in the bedroom. I went back out. I turned toward the main house, and then I saw her. Rosamond was on the ground at the base of the cottage steps, not collapsed dramatically, but folded the way a person folds when their body makes a quiet decision without consulting them. On her left side, knees drawn up slightly, one hand still reaching toward the bottom step. Her eyes were closed. The left side of her forehead, just above the eyebrow, had a swelling I could see from 10 feet away. I crossed the garden in less time than I can account for. I knelt beside her. 2 fingers to the sides of her neck, pulse present, fast, uneven. Rosie. I kept my voice level. Calm was the only thing I had to offer her. I'm here. Can you open your eyes? A small sound, someone surfacing from somewhere deep. Her eyelids moved, then opened slowly. Clay. Barely above a whisper. You're home. I'm home. I've got you. Don't try to move. I ran my hands over her carefully. Not a medical examination, but the assessment of a husband who needs to understand what he is dealing with before he picks her up. The swelling on her forehead, a scrape along her right forearm, and at the back of her head, at the base of her ponytail, something that made my jaw tighten in a way that had nothing to do with a fall. The hair there was disturbed, not from lying down, from a direction and a force that a fall does not produce. I did not say anything about that. I should have called 911. I know that a head injury, suspected cervical trauma, day 3 of fever. You do not move a person in that condition. But Dr. Miriam Cole Direct Line added 6 years ago, because Miriam is the kind of physician who gives out her direct line when she trusts a family to use it only when it genuinely matters. I said, I'm going to carry you to the car. We're going to the hospital. I need you to hold on to my neck. Clayton, I'm all right, Rosamond. Her full name the way I only use it when I need her to hear me without argument. Hold on to my neck. She held on to my neck. I carried her to the car. She weighs less than she did 10 years ago, something I had noticed before, and had not allowed myself to think about too directly. I settled her into the passenger seat and buckled her seatbelt the way you buckle a seatbelt when the person wearing it is the most important cargo you have ever been responsible for. I had my phone out before I was back around to the driver's side. Before I started the engine, I sent a single text to Helen Ashford. Rosie needs the hospital. Can you take Beckett until I'm back? Her reply came in under 30 seconds. Already on my way to your gate. She picked up on the second ring. Clayton, what's happening? I'm bringing Rosamond in, I said, pulling onto the road. The November rain was coming in sideways now. Head injury left forehead significant swelling, possible cervical trauma, fever of at least 39 degrees day 3. I need a full forensic documentation workup on arrival, not a standard intake. Photographs measurements mechanism of injury noted as undetermined pending examination. A brief pause. Miriam has been practicing emergency medicine for 24 years. She understood the difference between a husband who was worried and a husband making a specific request for a specific reason. I'll be at the entrance. How far out? 15 minutes. Bae will be ready. Is she conscious? Yes. She's with me. Good. Drive carefully. I hung up and drove. The road runs along the base of the valley, 2 lanes hills on the left, vineyards on the right. My hands know it without my attention, which was fortunate because my attention was divided. Rosamond had her head turned towards the window. After a moment, I reached over and put my hand over hers on the center console. She turned her hand and held mine the way she has held it for 43 years, with a grip that says, I know you are here, and that is enough. At the first traffic light on the edge of town, my phone buzzed. Delancey. Mom knocked some stuff over on the back porch and went to lie down. Bit of a mess out there if you want to come clean it up. No rush. I looked at that message for the length of a red light. 4 seconds. 5. Then I picked up my phone, left hand, still in Rosamond's, and took a screenshot with the timestamp clearly visible. In 31 years of audit work, I had learned to recognize when a person hands you evidence without knowing it. Delancey had just placed Rosamond at the back of the main house at the relevant time, described her as upright and mobile immediately before the injury, and attributed the situation to Rosamond's own clumsiness, all in a single voluntary text message sent to the one person in the world most motivated to preserve it. We call this a gift. She had placed Rosamond at the back of the main house. The injuries had occurred inside the hallway. The lie was already visible in the geography of her own words. I typed back 6 words I know. It'll be handled by morning. I sent it, set the phone face down. The light turned green. Who was that? Rosamond said quietly without turning from the window. No one important. We're almost there. She was quiet for a moment. Then, Clayton, whatever you're planning, be careful. I glanced at her pale profile against the rain-dark glass. Something in her expression that told me she understood more than she had let on. Maybe more than she had fully allowed herself to acknowledge until right now in this car, on this rainy Friday evening with her hand in mine, and a swelling on her forehead that neither of us was ready to talk about yet. I'm always careful, I said. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. No, she said softly. You're always thorough. That's different. She was right. Careful means you are trying not to get hurt. Thorough means you have already decided that the outcome is going to go a certain way, and you are simply making sure every element is in place before it does. I pulled into the hospital parking lot at 5:42. Dr. Miriam Cole was standing at the entrance in her white coat, two nurses behind her, with a look on her face that told me she had already begun. Miriam Cole does not waste motion. She met me at the entrance with a wheelchair already behind her, took one look at Rosamond in the passenger seat, and had two nurses at the car door before I had finished unbuckling the seatbelt. How long has she been conscious? Responsive when I found her. In and out on the drive. She spoke clearly about 10 minutes ago. Miriam's voice shifted as she leaned toward Rosamond, the voice doctors use when addressing patients rather than family. My name is Dr. Cole. You're at Portland General. Can you tell me your full name? Rosamond's eyes opened. She focused on Miriam with visible effort. Rosamond Eleanor Hawthorne. She said precise, almost primly, so the way her diction gets when she is concentrating hard. 66 years old. Viral pneumonia. And before you ask, I did not fall on my own. Miriam looked at me over the top of Rosamond's head. A look that lasted 1 second and communicated a great deal. They moved her into a bay, with the efficiency of a team that has done this 10,000 times. I stood at the edge of the bay curtain and watched Miriam work, calling for imaging, calling for a cervical collar, speaking to Rosamond in a steady, unhurried voice, while her hands moved over the injury sites with practiced accuracy. Rosamond answered every question the way a good witness answers questions, without embellishment, without minimizing. I watched my wife tell a doctor, item by item, what had been done to her. And I felt something in the architecture of my chest that I do not have a structural term for a load-bearing element giving way under more weight than it was designed to carry. After the initial examination, Miriam came to the bay entrance and looked at me with the direct, undecorated expression of a physician who has made a determination and intends to state it clearly. The hematoma on the left temporal region is consistent with blunt impact against a hard surface. The angle and direction are inconsistent with a forward fall. She did not hit that on the way down. She paused. There is also soft tissue inflammation along the posterior cervical region, consistent with sudden forceful traction injury. Something pulled her head backward against resistance. The abrasion on her right forearm could be a fall. The other two could not. I know, I said. Clayton, do you want me to document this as a forensic case? Yes, I said. Every injury, every measurement, every photograph, signed by you and countersigned by 2 additional physicians. Mechanism of each injury, classified specifically blunt impact traction force, incidental with your professional assessment of whether each is consistent with an unassisted fall. Tonight, before anything changes. I'll have it done by 8:30, she said. She went back behind the curtain. I walked down the corridor to the row of plastic chairs outside the imaging suite and sat down. I put my elbows on my knees. I put my face in my hands. I am not a man who cries easily. What happened in the next 60 seconds was not crying in any conventional sense. There were no sounds, no theatrical surrender. What there was, my shoulders moved. Once, against my will, without my permission, the way a building moves in an earthquake, not because it wants to, but because the force applied has exceeded the tolerance of its construction. 63 years of holding things together. 43 years of being Rosamond's husband. The image of her folded on the cottage path, hand still reaching for the step. The image of her on the hallway floor, lips moving with my name. My shoulders moved once. Then I took a breath that had to travel a very long way to reach the surface. Then I lifted my head, wiped my face with the back of my hand, straightened my jacket, and stood up. 60 seconds. Not one more. I walked back to the bay. By the time I pushed the curtain aside, I was entirely composed. Rosamond was propped up slightly, an ice pack against her left temple, color marginally better than in the car. She watched me come in with the expression she has always had when assessing whether I am actually all right or performing all right. After 43 years, she knows the difference better than I do. And Clay. She reached toward me. I took her hand in both of mine. You look like you've been standing in a wind tunnel. I'm fine, I said. You were out there for a while. I was thinking. Her thumb moved across the back of my hand. I should have told you sooner, she said, about how things had gotten. I kept thinking it was manageable. I'm sorry, Clayton. I should have told you. I looked at my wife, at the ice pack and the abrasion on her forearm, and the careful way she was holding her neck. At the woman who had spent 3 years absorbing what should have been told to me from the beginning. Rosamond Eleanor Hawthorne, I said. You have nothing to apologize for, not one single thing. Do you understand me? Her eyes went bright. She pressed her lips together the way she does when she is not going to cry, but is having to work at it. I understand you, she said. Good. Then let me do what I do, and trust me. She nodded the small, certain nod that means she has made a decision. All right, she said. I trust you. Miriam returned at 8:47 with a folder 11 pages thick. I opened it, standing in this corridor, and read every word. 3 injury sites. 3 mechanism classifications. 2 explicitly noted as inconsistent with an unassisted fall. Signed by Miriam Cole, MD, countersigned by 2 attending physicians. Every photograph time-stamped. Every measurement to the millimeter. I folded the report and placed it in my inside jacket pocket. I pressed it flat against my chest for a moment, the way you press something you are making sure is real. Then I called Alden. He answered on the first ring. Clayton, how is she? She's going to be all right, I said. 11-page forensic report, signed and countersigned. Mechanism findings are unambiguous. We're ready, Alden, all of it. Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. Bring Cora. A brief silence. I'll be there. Clayton. He stopped. Started again. I'm glad she's all right. So am I said. Good night. I hung up. I stood in the corridor with the report against my chest, and the weight of what was coming arranged in my mind with the clear, settled order of a case that has been prepared properly and is ready to be presented. Then I went back in to sit with my wife. I left the hospital at 10:15. Rosamond was sleeping a real sleep, medicated and deep, the kind that comes after pain has been properly addressed, and the body decides it can finally stand down. Miriam had arranged for her to stay overnight. I was grateful in the way you are grateful for things that prevent you from having to make a decision you were not certain you could make correctly. I wanted Rosamond somewhere safe while I did what I was about to do. Portland General, with its locked ward doors and its complete absence of anyone named Breckenridge, qualified. I drove home through the rain. The main house was lit up when I turned into the driveway living room. Windows bright, the television audible from the car. Preston and Delancey doing what they did every Friday evening, occupying the space as though it had always been theirs and always would be. I did not stop. I drove past, parked behind the cottage, and went in through the back gate. I unlocked my study, turned on the desk lamp, just the desk lamp, because I think better in a contained pool of light, and opened my laptop. The garden camera syncs automatically every 4 hours. The 6 p.m. sync had occurred while I was at the hospital, while Delancey was presumably pouring herself a glass of wine. The camera had quietly uploaded everything it had seen that afternoon, the way it has done every 4 hours for 5 years, without fail, without anyone in the main house knowing it still worked. I found the timestamp and opened the file. Wide-angle shot from the equipment shed Eve at 14 feet clear sightline across the back garden, the cottage entrance, the back door of the main house, and the hallway section visible when the door was open. Good resolution. Good enough. I watched it once. Then again with a notepad, logging each timestamp. I was on my second pass when I heard a light knock at the interior study door. 3 small knocks, the specific rhythm Beckett has used since he was 5 years old, and I taught him that you always knock before entering someone's workspace. "Come in, Motam," I said. He stood in the doorway in his pajamas, the blue ones with the small white stars, and his socks one with a hole in the toe, that I made a mental note to mention to no one, because Rosamond would want to replace them immediately, and she needed to rest. His hair was flattened on one side. His eyes were the eyes of a child who had not slept and was not going to until he had done what he came to do. He was holding the memory card between his thumb and forefinger, the way you hold something small you are making sure you do not drop. "Grandfather, I've been waiting for you to come home." "I know," I said. "Come in. Close the door." He walked to the desk and held out the card. "I recorded everything," he said. "Mom hurt grandmother on purpose. I was at the corner of the cottage the whole time. I made sure the angle was right before I pressed the button." A pause. "You told me the angle matters?" "I did tell you that." I took the card from his hand. It was warm from being held for 9 hours. "Thank you, Beckett. Is grandmother going to be all right?" "She is," I said. "She's sleeping at the hospital tonight being looked after. She is going to be all right. I promise you that." He let out a breath that had been held since 2:30 that afternoon. His shoulders dropped the way shoulders drop when something carried at chin height is finally allowed to come down. I inserted the card and opened both files on screen at once, the garden camera in the left window, Beckett's watch footage in the right, synchronized by timestamp. What it is like to watch 2 simultaneous recordings of the same event match. Is this not approximately match? Not mostly match, but match the way 2 instruments in a well-tuned orchestra match precisely, completely, with no room for interpretation and no gap through which a reasonable doubt could pass. Every sound appeared on both tracks, offset only by the distance-based delay that physics predicts. The garden camera showed the wide picture. Beckett's watch showed the close one. Together they showed everything. Beckett stood beside me with his arms folded. He did not look away. When the footage ended, I closed both windows and sat back. "Grandfather," he said, "are you going to make it right?" I looked at my grandson, 8 years old, star print pajamas, 11:30 at night, having held a piece of evidence for 9 hours, without panicking, without telling anyone, without letting go. "Yes," I said, "I am going to make it right." "All the way right," he said. "Not just a little bit right? Was all the way right?" I said. "Every single bit of it." He considered this with the evaluating expression of someone deciding whether to accept an answer as sufficient. Then he nodded the same small, certain nod his grandmother uses when she has made a decision. "Okay," he said. "I believe you." I put my hand on the back of his head the way I have done since he was an infant, the gesture that means I see you and you are not alone. "Go to bed. I'll come check on you in an hour." He went. I listened to his footsteps in the hallway, soft in his holed sock, and the sound of his bedroom door closing gently. Then I called Alden. He answered in 2 rings. "I've been awake," he said. because Alden has known me long enough to understand that a call at 11:30 from my number is not a social event. Full coverage, I said. Audio and video, 2 independent sources, 0 gaps. Timestamps align perfectly. There is no argument to be made. File everything at 8 tomorrow morning. Every charge we discussed. 3 seconds of quiet. Then it'll be done. And Alden, bring Cora Sims. I want her there by 9. She'll be there. Good night, Clayton. I hung up. I went to check on Beckett. He was asleep, breathing evenly, the memory card adapter still on my desk. Empty now, its contents across 3 servers in 3 locations, backed up twice, beyond the reach of anyone who might want to make them disappear. I stood in his doorway the way I had stood in Rosamond's cottage doorway 3 years ago, watching her sleep and telling myself there was still time. I could still manage this. I had been right. There had been time. I had used it well. I went back to my desk, set my alarm for 6:30, and sat with the quiet of the valley around me, thinking about nothing in particular and everything at once. Before I reveal what Clayton set in motion at 8 o'clock that Saturday morning, drop the word justice in the comments. Let me know you're here, because this next part changes everything. Note this story includes fictional elements woven in for depth and meaning. If you'd prefer to stop here, that's completely fine, but if you stay, I promise the ending is worth it. I set my alarm for 6:30, but was awake at 5:54. That is how it has always worked. Before a significant proceeding, my body makes its own decision about when preparation ends and execution begins. I dressed carefully. The navy suit, the one I wore for 31 years, whenever work done in private was about to become a matter of public record. Rosamond had pressed it last Tuesday before the fever took hold, because she always pressed it on Tuesdays, and had not known that particular Tuesday how soon it would be needed. I looked at myself in the mirror for exactly as long as it took to confirm I looked like the person I needed to be today. Then I went to make coffee. Alden arrived at 8 o'clock. Precisely charcoal overcoat leather document case his own coffee, because he knows I make a full pot, and he prefers not to drink mine. Behind him came Cora Sims. Cora was 40 years old, a certified property appraiser and forensic asset documenter for 14 years, precise in the way that instruments are precise not through effort, but through construction. She had testified in 23 court cases in Oregon and Washington, and never once had her methodology successfully challenged. Her laptop contained the complete digital inventory of every item in the Hawthorne estate catalogued 3 months ago, during a quiet weekend when Delancey and Preston were in Seattle. Rosamond had let Cora through the front door herself with a cup of tea and the quiet composure of a woman who had spent 43 years reading her husband and had decided, without being told, that whatever he was preparing was necessary. Rosamond had not known the details, but she had known me. I should have trusted that sooner. "I'll need 30 minutes in the main sitting room," Cora said. "You have it," I said. Alden walked me through the court filing. Alden had filed the emergency occupancy termination notice with Yamhill County Circuit Court the previous evening as an emergency petition submitted electronically, with the complete evidence package attached: the forensic report, the authenticated footage, and a declaration of imminent risk to a vulnerable adult. Judge Patricia Wren had been notified at filing for emergency ex parte review. She signed at 8:41 that morning, before either of them had finished their coffee. As of 8:41, I said, "Their presence in this house is a violation of a court order." "Correct," Alden said. "Security from the residential association stands by at 12:30 if needed." He paused. "Clayton, you could simply have the order served and let the rest follow." "No," I said. I want them to sit in that room and hear every piece of it in order from the beginning. I want no question in any of their minds about how completely they miscalculated. I picked up my coffee. Then I want them to leave. I called Marcus Webb at 8:05. All supplemental authorization cards revoked as of 8 this morning, Marcus said. The vehicle lease account has been flagged for same-day termination. Recovery service is standing by. He confirmed the full account history, $847,231. Withdrawn or charged against Hawthorne Consulting LLC accounts over 38 months. That figure encompassed not only the 3 wire transfers to Lavinia's personal account, but 38 months of supplemental card charges for personal expenses, luxury goods travel, and cash advances that bore no relation to any legitimate business purpose. Not $1 from Preston's or Delancey's own income. I let that number sit for a moment, not because it surprised me, but because hearing it in Marcus Webb's flat, professional voice made it real in a way the spreadsheet had not quite managed. "I'll need you at the house at noon," I said. At 9:03, the flatbed truck from Pacific Northwest Auto Recovery turned into the driveway. I watched from the sitting room window, standing back from the glass, the way I had stood at 100 windows in 31 years of audit work, watching people respond to consequences they had believed were never coming. Delancey came out at 9:07 in linen trousers and the Hermes bag, Mercedes key in hand, walking with the energy of a woman who has decided the morning belongs to her. She turned toward the driveway and stopped. 2 men in gray coveralls were already attaching the front wheel rigging. A third stood with a clipboard bearing the Hawthorne Consulting LLC letterhead. "What are you doing?" "Get away from that car. That is my car." "Ma'am, this vehicle is registered to Hawthorne Consulting LLC. The lease was terminated this morning at 8 a.m. We have a valid recovery authorization signed by the account holder." "I am contacting him right now," Delancey said, phone already at her ear. I watched her wait through 4 rings, watched her pull the phone away and look at the screen, watched her dial again. I was not going to answer. Not today. Not by phone. From the other side of the stone wall separating our property from Helen Ashford's garden, I could see the top of Helen's gray head moving with the slow deliberateness of someone engaged in the extremely thorough inspection of her own rosa bushes. The angle provided an unobstructed view of our driveway. Helen's phone, I noticed, was in her left hand rather than her pocket, the flatbed winch engaged. The Mercedes rose onto the truck bed at 9:22. Delancey stood at the edge of the driveway, Hermes bag clenched in both hands, watching $40,000 of vehicle she had never owned get loaded onto a truck and driven away. My phone buzzed at 9:46. Marcus Webb Preston's card declined at the Meridian. 3 separate cards. He's still at the table. Both guests have left. I set the phone down. I looked out at the valley. "Alden," I said, without turning from the window. "They'll be coming through the front gate at 11:15. Lavinia first, then Delancey." "How do you know?" I turned around. "Because Delancey called Preston 19 times between 9 and 11, and Preston is sitting alone at a restaurant in Portland, trying to pay a $1,400 check with no working cards. When she cannot reach him, she will call her mother. And when Lavinia arrives, she will walk through that door believing she is the reinforcement." I picked up my coffee. She is not the reinforcement. She is the last piece. Alden looked at his document case, selected a folder, placed it at the top of the pile. "Then I suggest we be ready," he said. "We are ready," I said. "We have been ready for 5 years. I did not see what happened at the Meridian restaurant that morning, the same way I was not home on Friday afternoon. What I know comes from Marcus Webb's texts, a phone call at 11 and 34 years of knowing my son well enough to reconstruct the shape of a situation from its outline. Marcus sent the first text at 10:17, cards declined. First attempt on the black card. I was in the sitting room with Alden. I read it and set the phone down without comment. Alden raised an eyebrow. I shook my head, not yet, and he went back to his notes. The second text came at 10:23, second card declined. He tried the Visa, manager involved now. I thought about Preston. At that corner table, he always requested corner tables, believing they conveyed authority, with two potential investors across from him, and the particular silence that descends on a fine restaurant when a card is declined. Not a loud silence. A specific one that everyone is aware of and no one acknowledges, because that is how these things work in rooms with good lighting and expensive wine lists. The third text arrived at 10:31, third card declined. Both guests have left the table. Preston is still there. I looked at that last line for a moment. Preston is still there. I could picture it, my son sitting alone at a corner table, a check he could not pay, the empty chairs where the two men had been. I had watched Preston fail at things before. Each time I had told myself the next one would be the one that changed something in him. Each time I had been wrong. This time I did not tell myself that. I set the phone face down and looked out the window at the valley. Alden looked up. About Preston, and about whether there is a version of today where any of this turns out differently for him, I said. And concluding that there isn't. He made the choices that produced this morning. I made the choices that revealed them. Those are separate actions with a single result. Alden was quiet. Then carefully, "He is still your son, Clayton." "I know that," I said. "I have not forgotten that for a single hour of his life. Knowing it doesn't change what's true." He went back to his notes. Marcus called at 11:03, calling rather than texting. Told me the situation had reached a conclusion that required more than a text to convey. "He's out," Marcus said. The manager worked out a payment arrangement. Preston gave them a personal check from an account with a current balance of $212 that's going to be its own problem in a few days. Both investors called the main office to withdraw from the venture, within 20 minutes of each other. A pause. He called Delancey 17 times between 10 and 11. She didn't answer. Then he stopped calling anyone. He took a ride-share to the corner of Burnside and 23rd and got out and started walking. In the rain. I held that image for exactly as long as I needed to. My son walking through the Pearl District in November rain, in the suit he had worn to impress investors, 17 unanswered calls on his phone, a check at a restaurant that was not going to clear. Then I let it go. "Thank you, Marcus," I said. "I'll see you at noon." I walked to the sitting room window. The front driveway was empty, the Mercedes was gone, and the space where it had sat for 3 years looked different, without it slightly more honest about its actual dimensions. At 11:14, a taxi turned into the far end of our road and came up the hill at the deliberate pace of a driver checking addresses. It stopped at our gate. Lavinia Breckenridge got out first, camel coat, large handbag, the posture of a woman who has been rehearsing a confrontation in the back of a taxi and has decided she is going to win it. She looked at the empty driveway. She looked at the space where the Mercedes had been. Something compressed slightly in her shoulders, a fractional adjustment in the angle of her chin. Then Delancey came through the front gate to meet her, changed out of the linen trousers into dark jeans and a structured jacket. Her hair pulled back, her phone still in her hand, still waiting for Preston to answer a call that was not going to be answered today. The two women spoke in low, rapid voices at the gate. I could not hear the words from where I stood, but I could read the conversation in the architecture of their bodies. Delancey's hands moving Lavinia's chin, going up, both arriving at the same conclusion through different routes. Then Lavinia straightened her coat, squared her shoulders, and walked through our front gate with the determined step of a woman who has decided the best response to a difficult situation is to become louder than it. I stepped back from the window. I picked up my coffee, cold now. I drank it anyway. "They're here," I said. Alden closed his document case, opened it again to confirm the folder order, then closed it a second time. "Ready?" he said. Cora looked up from her laptop. Both camera indicator lights were green. "Ready?" she said. I walked to the sitting room doorway and stood with one hand on the frame, listening. The front door opened. Delancey had a key, of course, right up until this morning, when the locksmith I had called at 7 a.m. had quietly done what locksmiths do. Then the sound of the key not working. Then a knock, sharp and impatient, on the front door of a house that no one named Breckenridge had ever owned. I let them knock twice. Then I walked to the door and opened it. Lavinia looked at me across the threshold with the expression of a woman who has prepared an opening statement and intends to deliver it. She opened her mouth. "Good morning, Lavinia," I said. "Please come in. There are some things I need to show you." I stepped back. I gestured toward the sitting room. And in the particular tone of a man who has been waiting a very long time to say exactly these words in exactly this order, I said, "We have been expecting you." I was seated at the head of the oak table when they came in. Rosamond's parents had given us that table as a wedding gift, solid and permanent, and belonging to exactly one family. Alden was to my left, document case, open folders in sequence. Cora was to my right, laptop, open, 2 cameras running at opposite corners of the room. I had placed 3 chairs on the opposite side of the table. 3, not 2. I had known Preston would come. I had simply known he would come last. Lavinia walked in ahead of Delancey, because Lavinia had decided she was going to set the terms of this conversation. And entering first is how people who think in those terms announce their intentions. She stopped when she saw the arrangement, the cameras, the documents, the lawyers. Something shifted in her expression. Not fear yet. The alertness of a person who has walked into a situation that does not match what they prepared for. "What is this?" Her voice was loud, in the way voices get loud when covering uncertainty. Some kind of performance, a family intervention. She looked at Delancey. "Did you know about this?" Delancey had stopped in the doorway, eyes on the cameras. "No," she said, quieter than her mother and faster at recognizing what she had walked into. "Please sit down," I said. "I don't think I will." Lavinia turned fully toward me, drawing herself up. "I want to know what gives you the right to sit in your son's home like you own the Mrs. Breckenridge." Alden's voice was pleasant and cut through her sentence with the efficiency of someone who has interrupted more important people in more consequential rooms. "Please sit down. What you just said is directly relevant to the first item we need to discuss. I suggest you hear it before you continue." Her mouth closed. She sat. Delancey sat beside her, placing her phone face up on the table, still waiting for a call that was not going to come. At 11:23, the front door opened. Preston came in. He was wet. His suit jacket was dark across the shoulders. His hair flattened his shoes, leaving small prints on the entry floor. He stopped in the doorway and looked at the table, at his wife, his mother-in-law, his father, the attorney, the woman with the laptop. Confusion crossed his face first, then recognition. Then something that was not quite dread, but was close enough that the distinction did not matter. He sat in the third chair without being asked. "Good morning, Preston," I said. He looked up. Dad. The word carried only what was necessary to produce it. Where's Mom? Your mother is at Portland General, I said. She's recovering. She is going to be fine. Something moved across his face. I did it without acting on it. Alden, I said. Alden opened the first folder. I want to begin with the property, he said. Specifically with a question that seems simple but is rather important. Who owns this house? Preston does, Lavinia said immediately. It's his family home. It is not, Alden said. Not unkindly. As a fact. It has never been Preston's property. Not at any point. He slid the title summary across the table. The Hawthorne Estate, 14 acres, Willamette Valley, Yamhill County, was transferred into an irrevocable living trust in November of 2019. The sole beneficiary is Beckett James Hawthorne. Not Preston. Not Delancey. Beckett. The trust is locked until Beckett reaches 25. Neither of his parents has standing to access, encumber, or act upon any asset held within it. This includes the house you are sitting in, the land, and everything inside it. Lavinia had stopped talking. Delancey's phone had gone dark on the table, and she was no longer watching it. Preston was looking at the document with the expression of a man reading a map and discovering the place he thought he was standing does not exist. The arrangement under which you have been residing here, Alden continued, was a conditional occupancy agreement executed in 2021. The primary condition was the ongoing provision of a safe, respectful environment for Clayton and Rosamond Hawthorne. That condition was violated on Friday afternoon, the 14th of November. He placed the forensic medical report in the center of the table, 11 pages, Dr. Cole's signature on each. Then beside it, the emergency occupancy termination order, Yamhill County Circuit Court seal. Judge Patricia Wren's signature, time-stamped 8:41 a.m. As of 7:52 this morning, your occupancy has been terminated by court order. You are required to vacate today. Failure to do so constitutes criminal trespass under Oregon revised statutes. Lavinia found her voice thinner, now sharper. You cannot do this. Preston has rights. Beckett is his child. You cannot simply, watch me, I said. 2 words. Quiet. Level. I held Lavinia's gaze with the stillness of a man who has been waiting 5 years for this moment and has found now that it has arrived, that it feels exactly as he thought it would, not triumphant, not angry. Simply necessary. Simply right. The sitting room door opened. Beckett stood in the doorway, in his school clothes, navy sweater, khaki trousers, good shoes. Rosamond had always insisted on proper clothes for Saturdays, and whatever else had happened in this house, Beckett had held on to that habit. He looked standing in that doorway at 8 years old, more composed than any of the 3 adults sitting across the table from me. I looked at him. I nodded once. He came in and stood beside my chair. He looked at his mother. He looked at his grandmother. He looked last and longest at his father. Preston looked back at his son. Something happened in his face that I had not seen there in a very long time. Not calculation. Not evasion. Not the practiced blankness of 3 years watching his wife run their household as though it were a campaign. Something underneath all of that. Something that looked from where I was sitting like the first honest emotion he had allowed himself to feel in this house since the day he walked Delancey through the front gate. He could not hold it. He looked away. Delancey did not look at Beckett at all. She was looking at Alden's document case with the slightly unfocused expression of someone doing mathematics in their head and not finding answers. There's more, I said. Alden. Alden opened the 3rd folder. The third folder contained a single document, a transaction summary, 12 pages, formatted the way financial evidence is formatted when it has been prepared for a federal proceeding. Clean columns. Precise figures. Date, amount, authorization code, destination, account, classification. Alden slid it to the center of the table. Over the past 38 months, he said 3 wire transfers were executed from the Hawthorne Consulting LLC operating account to a personal savings account registered to Lavinia Ann Breckenridge. He looked at the document, not at Lavinia, letting the evidence do the talking. 3 transfers. Aggregate total $180,000 routed across 14 months to a personal account bearing no loan agreement, no promissory note, and no repayment schedule of any kind. Each transfer was spaced to avoid automatic fraud detection thresholds. That spacing is not coincidence. It is method. He let that sit for 3 seconds. Long enough to land. Not long enough to become theatrical. Each transfer was authorized using the supplemental card issued to Preston Hawthorne. The Hawthorne Consulting LLC account is a sole proprietorship business account registered exclusively to Clayton Hawthorne. The supplemental card was issued for specific limited purposes: vendor payments, travel expenses under $10,000 per transaction. Wire transfers to personal accounts are not among the authorized uses. He paused. Under 18 United States Code Section 1343, the federal wire fraud statute, each unauthorized transfer constitutes a separate federal offense. 3 transfers. 3 counts. Preston had authorization. Delancey said, her voice too high, too fast. He's been managing accounts for 4 specific categories. Alden said, still pleasant, still level. The card agreement he signed in 2021 lists them explicitly on page 9. You're welcome to review it. She did not review it. She looked at it the way people look at things they cannot argue with but have not yet accepted. Lavinia had gone very still. Not the stillness of a woman positioning herself, the stillness of a woman who has just understood something and does not like what she has understood. Alden turned to her directly. The bank has placed a hold on the transferred funds and issued a formal recovery demand letter. He placed the notice on the table in front of her, Pacific Northwest banking letterhead, Marcus Webb's signature at the bottom. The letter requires you to demonstrate repayment capacity within 48 hours. If you cannot, the bank will proceed to civil litigation to recover the funds, and the first asset they will move to freeze is any real property in your name. A pause. Our records indicate you hold a condominium in the Pearl District. I would suggest you speak with your attorney before that window closes. Lavinia's right hand came up from her lap and pressed flat against the table. Not aggression, just an anchor, the way hands reach for solid surfaces when the ground has shifted beneath them. That money was a loan, she said. Preston offered. There is no documentation of a loan agreement, Alden said. No promissory note, no repayment schedule, no signed acknowledgement. In the absence of documentation, the transfers are classified as unauthorized. Cora opened her laptop and turned the screen toward the center of the table. Every item of real and personal property within the Hawthorne estate has been cataloged, photographed, and assigned an identification number in the Beckett James Hawthorne Trust Asset Register, she said. Every room, every piece of furniture, every fixture and object of value. She clicked on the sitting room. The inventory populated the oak table, the fireplace surround, the oil painting above the mantel, the fir floors, the curtains Rosamond had chosen in 1996. Every item in this house belongs to the Beckett James Hawthorne Trust. Not to Clayton Hawthorne personally. Not to Preston Hawthorne. To Beckett. Any item removed without written authorization from the trust administrator is subject to recovery. Any item damaged or destroyed is subject to civil liability. She said it without inflection, a fact stated, not a threat delivered. I want that understood before we continue. Preston had not spoken since he said my name when he walked in. Now he looked up from the laptop screen and across the table at me. It was the first time in this room on this morning that he had held my gaze for more than a second, the first time, I would say, in much longer than that. There was something raw in it that did not have the protection of all the things he usually kept between his eyes and the world. Not anger, not accusation. Something quieter and harder to look at than either. I looked back at him. I did not say anything. I did not look away. 4 seconds. Then his jaw moved. He looked back down at the table. "One final matter," Alden said. He placed the last document on the table. The video evidence package chain of custody documentation included technical authentication from the digital forensics firm. On Friday afternoon, 2 simultaneous independent recordings were made of the events on this property. 2 separate devices. No coordination between operators. The footage has been authenticated as unaltered and reviewed by Dr. Miriam Cole, who confirms the injuries documented in her forensic report are consistent with what the recordings show. He placed his hand flat on the document. This evidence package has been submitted to the Yamhill County District Attorney's Office this morning in support of criminal charges under ORS 124.100 felony elder abuse and related statutes. Delancey had been very still through the last several minutes. Not the stillness of calm, the stillness of a person using every available resource to process what is happening and having none left for physical motion. Then I saw the shift. I have watched it happen in 31 years of audit work. The moment a person moves from trying to find a way through a situation to deciding that if they cannot have what they want, they will do damage on the way out. It has a specific look. I had told Cora to watch for it. I had told her what to do when she saw it. Delancey pushed her chair back and stood up. Her eyes moved around the room until they stopped on the north cabinet on the top shelf. The pale blue and white vase that had sat there for 9 years, item 47 in the trust register. Cora's hand moved to her laptop, quietly. "Delancey," I said. She did not look at me. "Delancey. Level. I would think very carefully about what you are about to do." She looked at pieces of people who have been cornered completely and have chosen in that corner to burn something down. You don't get to just... Her voice cracked on the word. She stopped. Started again, quieter, but not steadier. You don't get to sit there with your lawyer and your files and just take everything. This is our life. This is our home. You cannot tell me that none of this was ever... It wasn't, I said. Quietly, completely. Not 1 square foot of it, not 1 single day. She reached for the vase. Delancey's hand closed around the neck of the vase. She had not chosen it because it was valuable or because she knew its history. She had chosen it because it was the nearest thing on the nearest shelf, and she needed something to do with her hands that matched the size of what she was feeling. I had known she would get there. I had told Cora she would get there. And Cora had her secondary camera running and her documentation tablet open before Delancey's arm had finished its arc. The vase hit the fur floor at 11:47 a.m. Not a dramatic crash. A sharp, definitive crash. The sound of something that had survived 345 years being ended in under 2 seconds by a woman who had run out of other options. Pieces scattered across the floor. No one moved. Cora Sims moved. She stood with her documentation tablet already in hand, walked to the largest fragment, crouched down, and began. "The item 47, she said in the tone of someone reading a grocery list. Qing Dynasty ceramic vase, circa 1680. Appraised value $34,000. Assigned to the Beckett James Hawthorne Trust Asset Register Identification Number, BHT-047. Status destroyed. Cause deliberate physical impact with the floor initiated by Delancey Breckenridge Hawthorne, witnessed by 5 adults and 1 minor child. Timestamp 11:47 a.m. Saturday, November 15, 2025. Secondary camera confirms." She stood back up and looked at Delancey with the expression of someone who has completed a task to her satisfaction. "Miss Breckenridge Hawthorne," Alden said, voice unchanged in volume or cadence. "You have just committed criminal mischief in the first degree under Oregon Revised Statutes, Section 164.365. Class C felony. Maximum sentence 5 years. The asset belongs to a trust for the benefit of a minor child. Enhanced protections apply. Civil liability attaches to you personally and cannot be discharged in bankruptcy. I am telling you this because you have the right to understand what you have just done." Delancey stood in the middle of the broken pieces, breathing in the tight, shallow way of someone whose body has caught up with a decision their mind made 3 seconds ago. "Delancey." Preston's voice, rough, uncertain, stripped of everything a voice acquires when it has been performing for a long time. He was leaning forward, looking at his wife with an expression that could not be reduced to any single thing. "Stop," he said. "Please, just stop." She looked at him. Something passed between them I chose not to try to read. Lavinia had not moved from her chair, hands in her lap, eyes on the vase fragments, the expression of a person who has been certain for a long time that a particular outcome was not possible and has just discovered that certainty carries a cost. Beckett, beside my chair, looked down at the pieces, then up at me. "Grandfather," he said quietly. "That was Mom's favorite." "I know," I said. It was. His jaw tightened, the same jaw tightening I had watched his grandmother do 1,000 times, the physical signature of a Hawthorne deciding not to cry. He straightened up and looked straight ahead in the manner of a child who has decided the situation requires composure and intends to meet it. I put my hand on his shoulder. "Mrs. Breckenridge," Cora said, still documenting. "The silver serving pieces on the east sideboard are trust items BHT 112 through BHT 119. The jewelry in the master suite is catalogued BHT 201 through BHT 214, noted as temporary personal loan from Rosamond Eleanor Hawthorne, returnable on demand. I want everyone in this room to be clear about what belongs to whom before anything leaves these premises." Lavinia's eyes moved to the sideboard, then to Cora, then to me. A negotiation opened and closed in her expression in under 2 seconds. "I'd like to call my attorney," she said. "There is a sitting room off the entry hall," Alden said. "Available for private calls." She stood, took her handbag, and walked out without looking at her daughter, or at Preston, or at me. The door clicked shut louder than she probably intended. Preston was still at the table, elbows down, looking at the floor where the vase had been. Delancey had moved to the window, back to the room, arms crossed, looking out at the valley. My phone rang. The screen read, "Chairman Meridian Pacific." I walked to the opposite window and answered. "George," I said. "Clayton. Our board completed the review of the audit irregularities you flagged. The findings are consistent. Preston is being placed on administrative leave effective today, pending formal termination Monday morning." A pause. I should have moved faster. I'm sorry. You moved when you had the information you needed, I said. That's the right sequence. I ended the call. I walked back to my chair. I sat down. I looked at Preston, at the wet shoulders of his suit, at his hands flat on the table, at his face, which had been stripped to something honest in a way it had not been in a long time. Preston, I said quietly. He looked up. Your phone is going to ring in the next few minutes, I said. When it does, I need you to answer it. His eyes found mine, and in them I saw that he already knew the way a person knows something they have been refusing to know, suddenly and completely, without the buffer of the refusal. Dad, he said. I know, I said. His phone rang. I did not hear what Meridian Pacific said to my son. I was across the room and did not move closer. The content of that call was Preston's to receive. Some things have to land directly to mean anything at all. He answered on the first ring. He said, Preston Hawthorne, when he picked up in the way you state your own name when you are trying to establish that you are, despite everything, still a person who answers professionally. Then he listened. What happened in his face was not collapse. It was settling the arrival of something that had been suspended for a long time, and finally been allowed to land. He said yes twice. I understand. Once. Then he set the phone face down on the table with the careful deliberateness of someone placing something they are finished with. He turned and looked at Delancey. She had been watching from the window. In the moment their eyes met, I saw the last thread of the arrangement they had built together stretch and give way, not with the sharp crack of the vase, but with the quiet finality of something that has been under tension too long and simply stops. Administrative leave, he said. Pending formal termination Monday. George Alderman did this, Delancey said. Or George Alderman did what the board asked, Preston said. After my father sent them an audit report. He paused. Which I assume has been in preparation for longer than this week. He was looking at me when he said it. Not with anger, with something harder to sit across a table from the look of a man who has traced a line backward and found at the end of it a decision made about him before he knew it was being considered. Yes, I said. It has. He held my gaze. Then he nodded, once the nod of someone who needed a thing confirmed, regardless of whether confirmation helps, and looked back down. The front door opened. Marcus Webb came in at precisely noon in his work coat, carrying a sealed manila envelope with Pacific Northwest banking letterhead. He walked directly to Lavinia. Marcus Webb, Regional Director, Pacific Northwest Banking. This is the formal recovery notice. It requires your signature acknowledging receipt. The 48-hour repayment window begins at the time of signature. Lavinia looked at the envelope, then at me. You arranged this, she said, less force than she intended. I asked Mr. Webb to deliver it in person, I said, so there would be no question later about whether it was received. She reached out and took the envelope. She signed with the pen Marcus produced from his breast pocket quickly, without looking at the signature. Marcus took it back, nodded once at me, and left without ceremony. The room settled into the particular quiet of a space where a great deal has just happened, and everyone knows it. Preston had not moved. Hands flat on the table, eyes forward, the stillness of a man who has run out of things to do and is sitting quietly in that fact. Preston, I said. He looked up. Nothing that happened today was done to hurt you, I said. It was done because what happened to your mother on Friday could not be allowed to stand, and because the situation that made it possible could not be allowed to continue. I am your father. I have not stopped being your father this morning. But I could not keep being your father in a way that did not include being honest with you about what you have been part of. He looked at me for a long time. His jaw was tight. His eyes were wet at the edges. He was not going to acknowledge it, and I was not going to make him. I know, he said. The voice of a man who has decided finally to stop pretending he doesn't. I know, Dad. Those 3 words. I had been waiting for them for considerably longer than this morning. I nodded. I looked at Alden. The next part. Alden opened the final folder. 2 remaining items. First, the residential security team will be here at 12:30, 28 minutes. He paused. The second item is Beckett. The room sharpened. Even Preston lifted his head. Beckett is currently the subject of an emergency temporary guardianship order issued this morning by Yamhill County Family Court, transferring primary guardianship to Clayton and Rosamond Hawthorne, pending full custody review proceedings. Alden placed the order on the table. The order is effective immediately. Beckett remains on this property. He does not leave with either of his parents today. Beckett, standing beside my chair, reached out and put his hand on my arm. I covered his hand with mine. For the first time since I had walked into this room in my Navy suit with 31 years of training and 5 years of preparation, I felt something ease in my chest that I had not realized was still held tight. Alden had called Sergeant Pruitt at 7:30 while I was dressing. Pruitt had said he would come at noon. He came at noon. 3 measured raps unhurried the knock of someone who has made it communicate that what follows will be orderly. Sergeant Dale Pruitt was 47 years old, 22 years with the Yamhill County Sheriff's Office, the last 9 in elder abuse and family crimes. Plain clothes, dark trousers, gray jacket badge on his belt because this was a notification visit, not an arrest. He shook my hand. Firm and brief. "Thank you for the documentation package," he said. It was thorough. He came into the sitting room and took it in the way officers take in rooms quickly, completely, without making it obvious. His eyes moved from Alden to Cora's equipment, to the vase fragments on the floor, to the 3 people at the table. He positioned himself equidistant from Delancey and Lavinia and folded his hands. Sergeant Dale Pruitt, Yamhill County Sheriff's Office, Elder Abuse and Family Crimes Unit. I've reviewed the evidence package submitted by counsel, the forensic medical report from Dr. Miriam Cole, the authenticated video footage, and the incident documentation. I'm here to advise you of your current legal exposure under Oregon state law. Lavinia's chin came up. I had nothing to do with... Mrs. Breckenridge. His voice did not rise. It did not need to. Let me finish. It will be more useful to both of us. Her chin came back down. Delancey Breckenridge Hawthorne is facing potential charges, including felony elder abuse under ORS 124.100 maximum 5 years, aggravated assault under ORS 163.175, and criminal mischief in the first degree under ORS 164.365 as documented this morning. He turned to Lavinia. Lavinia Breckenridge is facing potential charges including conspiracy to commit elder abuse and accessory charges related to the financial fraud under investigation. He looked at both women. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can be used against you. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford one, one will be appointed. Do you both understand? Delancey had gone very still. Then, without warning, her face broke the way ice cracks in warming weather quietly, and then all at once. Her eyes filled. She raised one hand to her mouth. I didn't... She stopped. started again, her voice wet and barely above a whisper. I didn't mean for her to get hurt. She just wouldn't listen, and Miss Breckenridge Hawthorne. Same temperature. Same cadence. Stop speaking. Contact your attorney before you say anything further. Do you understand? Her hand pressed harder against her mouth. She nodded. Preston was at the far end of the table looking at the surface in front of him, with the expression of a person who has arrived by a very long and indirect route at the place where things are exactly what they are. Pruitt looked at him. Mr. Hawthorne, you are not currently facing primary charges, but your presence at the time of the incident and your subsequent actions are part of the ongoing investigation. Retain counsel before speaking to anyone about Friday afternoon. Preston looked up. The look of a man who has run out of energy for indirection. I understand, he said. Thank you. Pruitt surveyed the room one final time. I'll give you 30 minutes to make any necessary calls before we discuss next steps. He moved to the side of the room and stood with his hands clasped. I sat back down. I picked up my coffee cold again and drank it. 30 minutes. Delancey called 6 numbers, none answered. Between the 4th and 5th attempt, she pressed the phone against her sternum and stared at the window with the expression of a woman discovering in real time the dimensions of her own isolation. Lavinia made 4 calls, the first to her attorney, the 3 that followed unanswered. Preston made no calls. He sat with his phone in his hand and did not use it. 10 calls. 0 answers. When the 30 minutes elapsed, Pruitt straightened his jacket. You'll be hearing from the district attorney's office regarding the formal charging decision. Have legal representation in place before that contact is made. He nodded at Alden, then at me. Mr. Hawthorne, I hope Mrs. Hawthorne has a full recovery. She will. Thank you, Sergeant. He left the way he came, directly without ceremony. The room was quiet. Delancey staring at her phone. Lavinia staring at her handbag. Preston staring at his hands. Outside, the Oregon rain continued patient and complete. Security will be here in 12 minutes, Alden said without looking up from his notes. The way you note the time of the next train. I suggest everyone begin identifying which personal items they need to take today. No one moved. Then Lavinia stood up. Her legs were not entirely steady, but she stood, picked up her handbag, and walked to the door without speaking to her daughter, or to Preston, or to me. The water was rising. There was no bridge left. The security team arrived at 12:32, 2 men in dark uniforms, professional and unremarkable. The older one presented the court order to Alden, confirmed the terms, and told the occupants they had 30 minutes to collect personal items and vacate. I watched from the sitting room doorway. Some conclusions should be allowed to arrive without the person who initiated them standing in the middle of them. Lavinia went first, pulling both suitcases from the south guest room herself. There was no one left to carry things for her. Delancey packed 2 bags in the master suite in quick, tight movements, too angry and too frightened to be careful. The jewelry in the top left drawer is catalogued as trust property, Cora said from the doorway. Items BHT 201 through BHT 214. Those remain? Delancey looked at the drawer. Her jaw worked once. She left it. Preston took 11 minutes. He went to the East Wing room that had been his since childhood. The valley view, the desk, still there. He came downstairs with 1 bag, a laptop case, and the framed photograph from his bedside table. Our last family vacation 12 years ago, before any of this had started. He set the bag down in the entry hall, looked up the staircase once at nothing in particular, then walked to the front door. I met him there. We stood in the entry hall of the house he had grown up in, with the rain outside, and everything between us arranged in a way it had never been before. I did not know what to say, and I had learned over 68 years that when that is true, saying something anyway is the wrong choice. So I put my hand on his arm, the way I had put my hand on his shoulder when he was 6 years old and had fallen off his bicycle and was trying not to cry. The same gesture 34 years later, carrying more weight than the first time. He looked at my hand, then at me. He nodded once. "Take care of yourself," I said. "Yeah," he said, rough and quiet. "I will." He went out the front door. He did not look back. Helen Ashford was at the stone wall along the property line when I came outside. She caught my eye and came around to the driveway edge. "Is she all right?" "Truly. She'll be home next week," I said. "She's going to be fine." "I stood at that wall for over an hour on Friday," Helen said. "I heard things I shouldn't have. If anyone needs me to say so officially, I will. Rosamond has been my friend for 16 years. I should have done more sooner." "You stayed," I said. That mattered. She nodded, the small, decided nod of someone who has accepted an answer and intends to hold on to it. She stepped back to her side of the wall. At the far end of the driveway, Delancey had stopped. She stood at the edge of the property where the driveway meets the public road bags at her feet and turned back to look at me. Her mascara had dried in tracks down both cheeks. The rain was coming down on her silk blouse. She did not move to shelter herself. "You did not have to do it this way," she said. Flat and exhausted, the anger burned through what remained more honest, and in some ways, worse. "You could have talked to us." I looked at her from the front steps. The rain between us. The court order in Alden's folder. The forensic report in my jacket pocket. An 8-year-old boy who had spent 9 hours holding a memory card in his closed fist waiting for me to come home. "What happened on Friday was not the beginning of this," I said. "It was the end of it. The beginning was the first morning my wife ate breakfast in her garden because someone had decided her dining room belonged to someone else." I held her gaze. My wife was on the floor of her own hallway saying my name. There is no version of that situation in which a conversation is the appropriate response. She looked at me for a long time. The valley spread behind her, gray and green and entirely indifferent. "You will never see us again," she said. "I have been married to the same woman for 43 years, I said. "I have never once regretted protecting her. Not for a single day. I wish you well, Delancey. I mean that. But I am done." I turned away and walked back up the front path. Beckett was standing in the doorway in his navy sweater and school shoes. His face arranged in the composure of a child who has been managing composure all day and is very nearly at the end of his reserves. I put my arm around his shoulders. He leaned into me with the weight of someone who had been waiting for something to lean into since Friday afternoon. "Is it over?" he asked, his voice muffled against my jacket. "The hard part is over," I said. "What's the easy part?" "Going inside and making hot chocolate," I said. Something happened in his face, not quite a laugh, but the first movement in that direction since Friday. It was in that moment the most valuable thing I had seen all week. I closed the front gate. I locked it. And then I took my grandson inside. I spent Sunday quietly. Beckett slept late. When he woke up, we ate breakfast at the cottage kitchen table, and he asked me to explain what a trust was. I explained it directly, the way you explain complicated things to someone who has earned the right to understand them. He listened, and when I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "So the house was always mine," he said. "It was always meant for you." That's not quite the same thing. But it's close. He nodded in the way he has of accepting complicated information without requiring it to be simple. Okay. Can I have more toast? I made him more toast. In the afternoon, I drove to Portland General. Rosamond was reading when I arrived. She had sent the nurse to find her another book from the waiting room shelf, which told me she was feeling substantially better. She looked up with the particular attention of 43 years that reads a person's face the way other people read weather. "Tell me," she said. I told her all of it. From Alden arriving at 8 to locking the gate at 1. She listened without interrupting, very still, book closed on her lap. When I finished, she was quiet. "The vase," she said. "Gone. Cora has the documentation." Another silence. Then, "And Preston?" "He left with one bag," I said. "And the photograph from our last family vacation." She looked at the window. Outside, the Sunday rain had softened to mist over the valley hills. She looked at it for a long time. "He took the photograph," she said. "He did." She said nothing more. Her hands moved to the blanket on her lap, smoothing it slowly in the way her hands move when she is holding something she has not yet decided how to carry. I reached over and covered her hands with mine. She turned her hand and held it, and we sat in the gray Sunday afternoon without saying anything further about Preston, because there was nothing to say that the quiet was not already saying. The formal results came Monday morning all at once. Lavinia had signed a cash purchase agreement for the Pearl District condominium, $240,000 below market value. The kind of price that happens when a buyer knows a seller has no leverage and no time. The agreement would close in 10 days. She had already arranged a wire to the bank against the sale proceeds to halt the civil proceeding. She would settle the recovery demand. She would also be without a home. Delancey's attorney spent 3 hours looking for a gap in the prenuptial agreement. The clause was unambiguous: willful harm against a Hawthorne family member forfeits all claims to marital assets and spousal support. No gap was found. Delancey would leave with her clothes and the debt she had made. Preston's formal termination arrived by email at 10:17 from Meridian Pacific's HR department. Alden had called earlier that morning to confirm that the district attorney's office had reviewed Preston's case separately. Given his full cooperation with investigators and the absence of direct physical contact, no charges were filed against him, though his name remained in the investigation record. He would carry that with him. That was consequence enough. Marcus Webb texted at noon, "All accounts settled. Nothing further on our end." I put the phone in my pocket and went to make lunch for Beckett, who was at the kitchen table doing homework with the slightly martyred focus of a child who has decided that ordinary life is resuming whether he finds it convenient or not. At 4:17, my phone rang with a number I did not recognize. Something made me answer, the same instinct that made me turn left toward the cottage instead of right toward the main house on Friday evening. Dad. Rough and quiet. Used hard for several days and not rested. I recognized it the way you recognize something that has been the backdrop of your life for 34 years. "Preston," I said. A pause, not of someone deciding what to say, but of someone who has already decided and is taking a moment to be present for it. "How is Mom?" 3 words. Not "I'm sorry." Not what happens now. Just 3 words asking about the one thing that had always been true about my son, regardless of everything else. "She's coming home Thursday," I said. "Dr. Cole cleared her this morning. She's going to be fine." A longer pause. I heard something in it I chose not to examine too closely, because grief between a father and a son is private even when everything else has been made public. Okay, he said. Good. Take care of yourself, I said. The same words I had said at the front door. He would know that. I'm trying, he said. Quiet. Without the performance of certainty he would have offered 6 months ago. He hung up. I sat at my desk with the phone in my hand. I thought about 34 years. About a boy who fell off a bicycle and tried very hard not to cry. About a photograph taken from a bedside table, the one thing carried out of everything left behind. I did not forgive him that afternoon. What I did was open a desk drawer and put the phone call in it carefully, the way you place something that needs to be kept, until you know what to do with it. Then I closed the drawer and went to make dinner for my grandson. Thursday afternoon, I drove to Portland General and brought Rosamond home. She walked through the front gate on her own 2 feet, in her dark green cardigan with the wooden buttons, and she stopped on the garden path and looked at the November roses and the hillside and the main house with its new windows. She breathed in the specific air of our specific hillside rain and fir and the mineral cold of the valley floor, and her face did something I do not have a word for and have not needed a word for in 43 years. There it is, she said softly. Not to me, to the place itself. I put my arm around her. She leaned into me with the weight of someone who has been waiting for something to lean into and has no intention of moving away. Welcome home, Rosie, I said. The following Saturday, Beckett came home from the Yamhill County Animal Shelter with a chestnut-colored dog he had decided with characteristic certainty to name Walter. I did not ask why Walter. Some decisions do not require explanation. 2 weeks after Rosamond came home, the Willamette Valley had its first clear day since before Thanksgiving. I was on the back porch at 7 with my Earl Grey when I heard her inside the main house, not as it had been, but as it was now. Gerald had finished the renovation in 12 days, working from the pencil sketch I had carried from desk drawer to desk drawer for 38 years, dated March of 1987. Rosamond's precise right-tilted handwriting, showing an open room with floor-to-ceiling shelves along the north wall and a greenhouse along the east side. She had drawn it the year after we broke ground, shown it to me once, and never mentioned it again when I said something inadequate about getting to it eventually. I had never forgotten it. Through the greenhouse glass, I could see Rosamond crouched over a flat of thyme seedlings, her lips moving slightly, the way they do when she is concentrating on something small and does not realize she is doing it. The swelling on her forehead was gone. The cervical brace was gone. She moved the way she moved in this garden before any of this, with the easy, unhurried attention of a person who is exactly where they are supposed to be. Grandfather. Beckett came around the side of the cottage in his Saturday-clothes soccer ball under his arm, Walter at his heels. Walter had spent the intervening week establishing that his primary purpose was to follow Beckett, and his secondary purpose was to sleep on the cottage porch. It's going to be nice today, he said, squinting at the sun. It is. He dropped the ball. It bounced twice on the flagstone path and settled near the base of the cottage steps. The steps with the cracked stone on the third riser where the baseboard had caught Rosamond's shoulder 3 weeks ago. Beckett looked at the crack. He had looked at it before. He knew what it was. Are you ever going to fix that? I crouched to his level the way I had when he was 3, and I was teaching him which clouds meant rain. No, I said. I want us to be able to look at it. Not to be sad, but so we remember what this place is for, and what we almost let it become, and what we chose instead. He considered this with the evaluating expression that had become familiar to me over the past 2 weeks. That makes sense, he said in the tone of someone who has reached an independent conclusion. Okay. He picked up the ball and headed for the back lawn, Walter bounding ahead. Rosamond came out of the greenhouse with her gloves in one hand and a small pot of thyme in the other. She looked across the garden at Beckett and Walter moving through the wet grass, and her face did the thing I have been watching it do for 43 years. The slight softening around the eyes when she is looking at something she loves. She set the thyme pot on the garden wall. She looked at the cracked step. "You're not going to fix it," she said, not a question. "No," I said. She nodded. That is the thing about 43 years. The words become over time almost optional. She took my hand the way she has held it since before Beckett was born, before Preston brought anyone through our gate, before any of this, with the complete uncalculated ease of something that has become as natural as breathing. "Every storm ends, Rosie," I said. She looked out at the valley, then at me. "It ended because of you," she said. I shook my head. "It ended because of an 8-year-old boy who understood that the truth is always worth recording, and because his grandmother taught him without meaning to exactly what it looks like when someone holds on." Across the lawn, Beckett had stopped running. He was standing still in the wet grass, with his arms slightly out at his sides, face tilted toward the November sun. Walter sat beside him, looking up in the loyal and slightly confused way of dogs who have decided that wherever the boy is standing is the right place to be. The thing I spent 40 years building was not the house, not the trust documents or the 5-year archive. Those were instruments. The thing itself was in the way Beckett stood at my desk at midnight, with a memory card in his closed fist, waiting for me to come home. It was in the way Rosamond said my name on that hallway floor. It was in the crack in the third riser of these steps which I was not going to fix, because the things that almost cost you everything are worth looking at every morning as a reminder of what everything actually is. Rosamond squeezed my hand once. She picked up the pot of thyme and went back into her greenhouse. I stood on the garden path in the November sun, watching my grandson and his dog, and I let the morning be exactly what it was. I am not a man who speaks often about God, but I believe the truth finds the light eventually, and when it does, it is because something greater than any of us refuses to let it stay buried. I call that grace. This is one of those dad's revenge stories that did not start with anger. It started with a desk drawer, a file, and a man who loved his wife too quietly for too long. I waited when I should have moved. I told myself patience was wisdom. Sometimes it was. But patience without protection is just another name for failure. So here is my honest word to you: if someone in your home is being made smaller every single day, do not wait the way I waited. Family justice is not a gift that arrives on its own. It is built carefully from evidence and love and the courage to stop absorbing what was never yours to carry. These are the dad's revenge stories that matter. Not the dramatic ones, but the quiet ones decided at midnight in a room no one else knows about. Family justice is a duty, and dad's revenge stories like this one always end the same way, with the right people around the table and the wrong ones walking out the gate. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment below. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you believe stories like this one matter, please subscribe. We will be here. Thank you for staying all the way to the end. Truly. A final note. The stories on this channel contain fictional elements shaped for reflection and meaningful conversation. If this kind of storytelling is not for you, we respect that completely. But if you choose to stay, we will always make it worth your time.